You give me a sliding doors alt history of Liverpool Football Club that I kind of am fascinated by.
I recently met Everton's old director of football who said that, they were this close to signing Robertson, but we swooped in there at the last minute.
Oh my God. By the way, the years of therapy I've had to experience after witnessing Andy Robertson house my team. I should send that ex-director of football the bills. It's Rog. Welcome back to our series, Running the Game, designed to delve deep inside football to understand how decisions are being made behind closed doors. And today we will go deep on data because, well, ever since Moneyball told the story of how our friend Billy Beane upended baseball by using metrics and analysis to challenge consensus and common wisdom, that approach has begun to embed itself into other sports, including finally football, where it's now being used to power traditional also-rans like Brighton and Brentford into sharp-toothed upper half of the Premier League table collectives, notably Liverpool Football Club, owned by Major League Baseball's data pioneers Fenway Sports Group of Boston Red Sox fame. A well-financed ownership group, yeah, but no match for the nation states and oligarchs who would own football. So they harness the power of collective thinking different through analytics to compete and then some. And I don't know if you heard, they've just won the Premier League. Again, second victory in the last 5 years. There was a Champions League win sprinkled in the year before that. How have they assembled a squad capable of delivering glory in this hyper-competitive football world? For those of us outside of the clubs, data usage is something we talk about, but honestly, it's opaque. We don't know how it's used to inform decisions. How is it growing? Where's it actually used? So to gain that insight, it's an incredible joy to welcome a giant brain in a bottle. The gent who built the first in-house analytics team in the Premier League, starting in 2012 at Liverpool. Since leaving in 2023, he's begun to consult for football clubs around the world with his company, Ludonautic's. He just wrote the quite magnificent book, How to Win the Premier League, which put it like this, quote, using data to analyse football, it's a bit like using dynamite. It's got the potential to be very powerful, but unless handled carefully, it can blow up in your face. Here to explain how to handle all of this dynamite data safely, it's your Ludonautics founder and CEO. It's Dr. Ian Graham.
Hello, Rog. What an introduction.
Oh, I'm shattered. It was longer than your book, Ian. It is the joy to welcome you. Liverpool winning again under Arne slot. No one called it before the season, but you got to tell me, did you, with all your friends to the numbers, did you have a sense, an inkling?
Yeah, so back in August, when the book was published in the UK first, I did the media rounds and the question was who's going to win the Premier League, and as the sort of data person, I said, well, it's going to be Manchester City again. That's where the data pointed. But I did say Liverpool had a chance, so we put it at 70% City, 20% Arsenal, 10% Liverpool, pretty much in line with what the bookmakers were saying.
Oh, so you're saying there's a chance, and we will talk about more of that in a moment, but a lot of listeners will be like, this man has our dream job. And your path is really fascinating. You got a PhD in theoretical physics from Cambridge University in 2005. I believe, is it true you studied E. coli?
I did, yeah. The signalling network of the E. coli bacteria, how it swims towards food and swims away from poisons.
Good Lord, you've just described the play of Dwight McNeil. But a year into your polymer physics postdoc, you're earning, I think, like $20,000 a year yet to publish. Bloody miserable. Your girlfriend passed along a job posting from the football world. You took it. You became head of football research at Decision Technology, where you consulted for Tottenham Hotspur transfers for 4 years until 2012. And you did it. You've been introduced by them by Billy Beane. These were primitive bloody days back then. Opta existed, the data pioneers. They gathered rudimentary numbers. Prozone, first real data company, I think. In those days, they recorded games on VHS and had someone count passes and shots by hand, which was pretty much the sum of it. Can you describe what football data was like back in those, essentially the prehistoric ages?
Prozone had been around since like late 90s, early 2000s. VHS recorded at the stadium and then couriered up or driven up by employees to the Leeds office, where it all got translated by hand into data. So they were the first company in clubs, and then Opta came along to try and sell to like media and bookmakers instead of clubs.
And what happened with it? I know your boss then, Damien Comolli at Tottenham, complained data, quote, told him the weather yesterday, but he wanted to predict next week. What could you actually do with it in these early, these are kind of like the cave days of football data?
Those early days, part of the problem was like gatekeepers. So Prozone had all the data, but they didn't want to share it with anyone, not even clubs. So I was kind of seen as really weird for asking them for the raw data. It's like, well, I don't want to see your summaries of the data. Show me the raw stuff so I can try to extract some signal out of it. And that raw stuff was, at a game level, the score, the attendance, the name of the referee, quite important. And you do things like cards, corners, number of shots. I think a lot of the interest was from the betting market. So things that were interesting for like bookmaking markets was a big part of it. And then when the player data became available, what was made public by companies like Prozone and Opta was number of passes, number of successful passes. Maybe you got number of passes in the opposition half if you were lucky. But it didn't really tell you anything about the game. And someone like Comolli, he knows football, and he could see that the data, that level of data wasn't really telling him, is this player any good or not?
It's a story of how you got there. At Decision Technology, you actually created something called the Castrol Performance Index, which a long-time football fans will all remember fondly. Essentially crunched the numbers, ranked players. You then consulted for the Times in London, which really did help bring data analytics into the public conversation, seeding it, which led to your dream job in 2012. I mean, I don't like to be hyperbolic, but it's kind of history changing. You joined your boyhood club, Liverpool, and were tasked with creating, quote, the first in-house analytics department in the Premier League. And in the book, you tell the story of how the first thing you told your new bosses was, I love this approach to getting a good job, but you said, don't expect to hear from me for 6 months. And you went into your bunker, you created the algorithms and formulas that these things would eventually deliver a bloody Premier League title. But the data was becoming more sophisticated. Take us into that bunker. How did you wade through the reams of numbers, determine what was important, what wasn't? How did you work out the key ingredients to success, essentially?
With a science background, so it's like important to have a theory and a concept of how the game works. And then you can test, is my theory any good or not? Does the game actually pan out like you predict it to? And really, the raw ingredients were needed before you could start doing that. And that raw ingredient was the information that goes into telling you that Dwight McNeil made 20 successful passes in this game. And that raw information is, in minute 1, he received the ball on the halfway line, carried it for 10 metres, and then made a successful pass into the box because he's a pretty good player. So you could see what happened just before the player got the ball, where on the pitch he was, and then what he did. And my idea, I wasn't the first one to come up with it. It's been like independently discovered many times. But the idea was to sort of track the state of the game. So we say we got the ball in midfield. Dwight McNeil then passes it into the box, and it's like we've now got the ball in the box, and any fan knows that's probably better than having the ball in midfield, right? And so the model that goes on top of that is just to measure what the chance of scoring and conceding is from that game state, and the players that move the game into a better state, we give them a little reward, and that reward is how much they've increased the chance of a goal. So it's directly related to, are you going to score a goal or not? It's not kind of saying, 10 passes equals 0.1 goals, or coming up with some sort of fake exchange rate where, passes are only correlated with success. They don't necessarily cause success. So I was trying to get to that cause of success.
You're telling us, it wasn't just coming out with the algorithm, it was working out how to break down and break through to the gatekeepers. I remember asking Billy Bean about data and football, and he said there's one thing defining the data, there's another thing working out how to use it and have that use be truly effective. And you tell the story of when you first met Michael Edwards, who had been your boss at Spurs, later became a quasi-legend as sporting director at Liverpool. In the book, you tell the story of a, quote, brutal 3-hour meeting. The first thing he said was, all this data analysis in football is BS, isn't it? But you slowly won him over. Frederick Mosteller, who founded Harvard's statistics department, has a quote, although we often hear that data speak for themselves, their voices can be soft and sly. So if that's true, how did you approach trying to win over skeptics like Michael Edwards initially?
In England particularly, and it's part of the reason for the slow uptake of analytics, there's a negative history to deal with. So it could be a whole podcast episode on its own, but the long ball game of Charles Hughes and Reap. Data was attempted in England and it went badly. So any sort of old manager or anyone in football for a long time is born with the knowledge that data in football is bad. So overcoming that is a difficult thing. And the only way around it is to be honest and to really explain the details of what you're doing. So the maths that goes into the models is hard, but the principles and the ideas behind the maths is easy. And if you understand football, you should be able to understand the principles. You know, I hope I can explain the model without you having to understand the details of the maths. And the other part of that honesty is kind of explaining what's not in the data and what it doesn't include. So in the book, I talk about a big argument we had about Modric, where, you know, he looked pretty good in my model, but he didn't look like a world-class midfielder. Whereas Michael's opinion was he's the best player in Spurs' squad because the data couldn't see how much pressure he was relieving for the team. You only saw the player on the ball. You didn't see directly the players around him or how difficult that pass was. We were having to estimate that. We couldn't see it directly.
That's incredible. I mean, I often think with Modric, if he had like a real professional footballer's haircut, like I'm pretty convinced Guendouzi is only a professional footballer because he looks so bloody good. If you had Guendouzi's haircut on Modric, like that, but ultimately it was Michael Edwards that saw that. He was not fooled by the lack of haircut.
Yeah, Michael had a pretty dodgy haircut himself, so you know you can't take his hairstyle into consideration. Yeah, so he was looking at the traditional football things. So, you know, things have changed now. You can see quality of touch in the data now. But back in those days, you couldn't see quality of touch. It came through via, you know, the amount of times you get on the ball and the number of successful passes you're making into dangerous areas. If you can do that a lot, you've probably got quite a good touch. But there are some horrendous looking players that can do that, and there are some very silky looking players who can't. And so he was seeing Modric's skill. He was picking up the things that the data couldn't see. And I think that's what the trick was at Spurs and at Liverpool as well, is data gets you 80% of the way there. It can get you a wide view of thousands and thousands of players. Use that as the benchmark from which to start, and then use your eyes to say, well, actually, I think he's a little bit better because I know this isn't included in your model, or I think he's a bit worse because there's other things not included.
So science meets art is ultimately in the self-awareness of that connection and what else needs to be funneled in. And talking about incredible haircuts, in your book, you describe meeting John W. Henry for the first time. The Liverpool billionaire American owner made his money initially from, I think, creating an algorithm to predict fluctuating soybean prices. There's an incredible line in your book about your first impression of John Henry. You wrote, if there were a World Cup of silence, John Henry would place in the semi-finals at least. And he's a fascinating character. He's an enigmatic, elusive character. What's he like? And how easy or how challenging was it for you to communicate with him via your numbers from the outset?
Enigmatic's a really good word for him. I know him a bit better today than obviously when I started at Liverpool. But we didn't speak too often. I think, you know, I'll always credit Fenway for the success I had in using data to try and make the team become better, because it was coming from the top, and with a lot of clubs that are trying to do a data-driven approach, there's a lot of internal resistance, and there was at Liverpool. But the message from John and his colleagues at FSG, Tom Werner and Mike Gordon, the message was always the same: we believe in what you're doing, keep doing it. If you're getting challenges, that's fine, don't worry about it. So definitely felt that support from John. And we kind of speak the same language. So when I was showing him the first results of the player ratings model, he got it immediately. He'd been through exactly the same process with the Red Sox. And so, I hope he was excited to see that process start to happen at Liverpool.
Yeah, let's get into the process, because it was frustrating at the outset. The club was then run under the management of Brendan Rodgers, that singular smile, that Gucci belt. Safe to say, you and he disagreed on transfers. He didn't like how player moves were done by the leadership group, the transfer committee at Liverpool. That did seem to come easier, at least at first, under Jurgen Klopp, the old Teutonic Care Bear. Michael Edwards was promoted to sporting director. The transfers, they started to hit. Players like Mo Salah, Sadio Mane, Bobby Firmino, Alisson, Virgil van Dijk. And I believe Edwards saw that if data, the manager and scouts all aligned on the player, then the transfer rarely failed. It's almost like somewhere in there is the 80-20 that you've just described. And you've said, this is amazing to me, that you don't like watching video footage of your target players because it, quote, biases you. So how do you find that balance when making football decisions? Because clearly just reading football stats like the Matrix, a system of charts, system of graphs, that's got those blind spots you're talking about.
I think the quote about me not watching players was cunningly edited. I don't like to watch players until I've looked at the data, because that's what biases me. And one of my thrills in football is understanding a player through the data, and then watching them on the video, and physically they just look different, or they've got a great first touch, or they've got a terrible first touch, the things that don't naturally come through the data. But, even I have to watch players. But I think the quote comes from, if you want an hour of my time, you want that to be spent looking at data. You don't want it, there are people better at watching players on video or watching players live than I am. I want to reassure myself as much as you that I do watch players live as well.
He does watch them live, but always with a blindfold on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the only honest way to do it.
What's that like for you, by the way, Ian? When you've come to know a player through the numbers, and then you actually see them, like all the habits, all the trends, all the model you built up in your head. It's like, I imagine going on vacation, like the best part is the anticipation, and the reality is often a lot more complicated. What's that like for you, that moment from numeric reality to reality?
The players live up to the data on average. The really interesting ones are the ones who don't, for whatever reason.
Give us an example.
Oh yeah, in the very early days, probably like the first ever version of the model, Messi was just entering his pomp in the late noughts, early tens, and this little, I thought little number 10 popped up in the data. He wasn't there yet, but he looked like a similar style player to Messi, a certain Marko Arnautović. And, for the first time watching him, it's like I expected a little foot on the ball sort of number 10, and Arnautović was definitely not that player. But, if you looked at his role in the team, what he did, how he created, there were some similarities with Messi there. And then the other one, this is current events relevant, is Ismail Assar. In his first season in France, he had a great first 700 minutes for Metz, I think he played for. You'll have to double check the facts on that one. And I watched the first sort of couple of 100 minutes of him. I thought, because he profiled a lot like Sadio Mane, I was like, wow, here's a player that profiles like Sadio Mane, but is massive. This guy's going to be a superstar. And then he kind of all the tools were there, but he wasn't a finished player yet. And it sort of became apparent that he was a player that I could tell that the scouts, certainly for Liverpool's standard at the time, the scouts would say not ready for Liverpool yet. A high ceiling player. It took him a long time to sort of reach his potential. So it's nice to see him finally getting some success.
God, I love that idea of Arnautović as like Messi, new and improved, swole Messi, big Messi. Like, what could possibly go wrong?
It didn't last for more than a season or so.
But there's an element of risk mitigation with footballers. You're always adding a new, almost a chemical compound to a locker room, a culture that's such a fragile thing. And I know at Liverpool that there was an informal ban on buying players over 24, and you often always steer clear early on to short-term fixes. Saying quote unquote experience, or he knows the league, fixer uppers, players didn't quite fit the style, cultural misfits too in terms of personality. I don't know how you test for that, but what are the big dangers to avoid when you are scouting and thinking about buying a player?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think, if you look at transfer fees received, those transfer fees start to decline, and just the chance of the player being transferred for any fee declines as the player reaches his late 20s, early 30s. Different positions got different age profiles. Centre-backs and goalkeepers skew a bit older, wingers skew a bit younger. And so when you think about building your squad and optimising your squad, you have to bear that in mind. The question is, what do I want out of this player? And the answer is going to be different depending on the club. So if you're one of the best teams in the world and you have to replace some top tier talent, and you don't care about getting a transfer fee in return, maybe a 27-year-old's fine. If you're a challenger club where you're going to have to fund your future seasons in the league through player sales, then those players at 27, they could keep you in the league and perform for the next 2 or 3 years. But then you ask the question, well, where's the money going to come from in 2 or 3 years to fund the next round of players? In that case, you want younger players with an upside that if those players work out, they'll be attracted by a bigger club. You can keep the cycle continuing. We did a sort of mega version of that with Coutinho, for example. He was one of our best players for years. But when someone offers you a price that's too good to turn down, and there are two great players that you think you can get into the club, then it's the time to sell.
I feel like you're tweeting me here, and you got my mind now panicked that me wishing Alisson back to Everton. Should I be pulling the trigger on that one? Should I fear that one?
I think as a Liverpool fan, I'd be delighted if Alisson goes back to Everton.
Oh my God, the levels in that. Don't listen to him, Richie, and he does listen to this show. We want you, we love you.
Moisey loves a defensive forward, and Richarlison's, he has to bring the defensive side of his game, doesn't he?
He's not old enough to come back to us just yet. A couple more years, baby, and then we'll take you. It is amazing what you're saying. The Coutinho pivot is obviously the key to this story. Klopp in there, Brodge era lessons learned. This title-winning squad, we didn't know at the time, but the assembly began. And one of the key pieces, still there, that plate of abs in sentient form. It's Mo Salah. God, I always loved that. Pay Mo his dough, like banners. But back then, when you brought him in, Mo had failed, in quotes, at Jose Mourinho's Chelsea. Rebuilt his career, but it was in Serie A, in Italy, with Fiorentina, and then Roma. So can you talk us through the process of Mo Salah as an example, how you identified and evaluated players? How did you laser in on the metrics that are important? I think, was it the abs to goals ratio? Was it X abs? Is that the data? And just ignore the common opinion that he couldn't hack it in the Premier League.
It was 2014, January 2014, our ill-fated title charge. We tried to sign him. Didn't have Swiss League data at the time. He was at Basel. He'd been brilliant. He played really well against Chelsea and against Spurs, I think, in UEFA competition. And he was a case of a player where, scouts and data were definitely aligned on this player. And I think it got to the point where the transfer fee from Basel went up and up and up so much that I became nervous because, we all thought he was a great player, but we were going to have to smash the Swiss transfer record, like double it, or increase by 50%. Shaqiri, I think, maybe might have been the record transfer out of that league beforehand. So it's like, we think he's great, but this is gonna be a big transfer for Switzerland. And then Chelsea just swooped in. I think to stop us from having the player more than them wanting it themselves, you'd have to ask someone from Chelsea. And then he went on to not play at Chelsea. So his failure was failure to get on the pitch. It wasn't that he played and he was terrible. In his 500 odds league minutes at Chelsea, he actually did all right. Even if you just look at the basic goals and assists data, it was all right. And then he went on to be brilliant. Really, really one of the best players in Italy. Age 24, in that wide forward position that we were desperate to get a right wide forward. And so we ask the question, okay, he's doing it in Italy. Does that mean he can do it in the Premier League? From a data point of view, Serie A is not that much lower quality than the Premier League. When we adjusted his performances to Premier League level, he was still shown up as above average, and he was only 24. So, we expect his curve to be upwards for a few more years, which it certainly has proved to be. And then the other question is, why did he fail at Chelsea? And you can never really know, but if you just look at their squad, Hazard was the first choice player in his position, and you look at their manager, Mourinho, who had all those Chelsea Academy talents at his disposal and didn't use them, who had Lukaku and De Bruyne at his disposal and didn't use them. And we thought, this probably says something more about Chelsea than it does about Mo, that he didn't get on the pitch. And then you could combine that with the player himself, the soft side. I call it the soft side, but understanding personality and motivation is really important in football. Not my speciality, but apparently, the single-mindedness and determination of Mo comes through immediately you meet him.
You were one of the early cheerleaders for the Salah signing. History has proven you to be unbelievably correct, like it will for me about Richarlison's second coming. But Mo is about to win his 4th Golden Boot award. At the time, I do know you're even more excited about a player the data loved, a Ghanaian midfielder from the Red Bull system, Mr. Naby Keita, brought for 65 million in summer 2018. It's fair to say didn't have quite the same impact as Mo Salah. I think you could also make the case injuries prevented him from ever truly putting his true best foot forward in that Liverpool team. His contract expired, most recently playing in Hungary. What did you learn from that experience, that transfer, that journey, and why in your mind do you pinpoint it didn't turn out as well as you'd expected or hoped?
What I learned was absolutely nothing. I still love Naby. I think the question we always ask at the time and afterwards as well. So we did this transfer review every year, and we'd go back and look at it to say, what did we think of these transfers at the time? Were they right or not? Not just for us, but players we tried for and didn't get, or players that went to other teams. What did we think of that transfer going to the other team? And our idea of a good process was, if we go back to that transfer and say, well, knowing if we try and imagine that we go back to 2017 or whenever it was, forget what actually happened and say all we know is everything up to this date, would we do that transfer again? I think with Naby, the answer's yes. For me, the answer's certainly yes. The sort of warning signs that only became apparent afterwards. He didn't have an injury history really in Germany, so those injuries weren't. And injury is something very difficult to predict. A past injury history tells you something about future injury risk, but Naby arrived without that history of injuries. Number of games you play in Bundesliga is not as high, but then again, he never was playing every game for Liverpool. I think the one thing that we could have known in advance was the way that he played the game didn't quite fit in with Jurgen's preferred way of playing the game, and he didn't adapt. That's one of my lessons from data: is don't expect players to change hugely. There are instances of them changing, but usually the player that comes to you is the player that you've seen for the last couple of years. To think I can change his position, or I can solve this weakness that he's got. If he's 20 or 21 years old, maybe you can. If he's 24, like Naby was, maybe you can't. And one of the reasons I love Naby is he just risks the ball all the time. It's chaos football. And I think like he's making the decision right more often than he's making it wrong. And I'm all for the chaos. And me and Jurgen, I hope he'll agree that we see football the same way. But I think the risk profile was a bit too much even for Jurgen. He wanted from his midfield stability. Naby had done the defensive midfield job in Austria, and I thought he could provide that stability. But when you got all that talent around you, you can't really blame Naby for trying the through ball every single time, which is what he did.
God, by the way, the way you think about footballers and your ability to not change them, it's how my wife thinks about partners. Like, don't think you're going to be able to change your partner when you go into that relationship. God bless both human truths. But your data collection, it continued to improve. A lot of betting market investment led to an explosion of data in football, almost hauling it into the modern age. You're tracking, location data. That technology let you better judge everybody on the field, particularly defenders, which have been elusive information for years. You talk about that Philippe Coutinho sale, the move to Barcelona for a startling $140 million plus incentives. So much of that money at Liverpool was pushed into the back line. In came Virgil van Dijk, the quite unflappable Dutchman, for a then record $100 million from Southampton, January 2018, and Alisson, your Brazilian goalkeeper with a strong wrist of an onanist from AS Roma for $70 million, a then record for that position later in the summer. This phase, it was really fascinating watching. It was almost like watching a baseball franchise just load up on great pitching as opposed to offense. What was your thinking back then in terms of all-in defensive emphasis, startling amounts of money for Liverpool Football Club at that stage?
We'd built one of the best attacks in Europe, and it was great to watch. But it was already kind of hard to fit all four attackers in. You got this sort of famous Mane, Firmino, Salah front line, and Coutinho has to fit into that. So he could fit in as a number 10, but that was Firmino's role really, of the sort of false nine, withdrawn striker, played almost as a 10. Or you play him in midfield, which you can do, but it leads to a lopsided, like, ultra-attacking team. It was really hard for us to get our attack any better. So I think we were certainly in the top 5 attacks in world football. And if you sort of look at what money do you need to make this attack better? Well, first of all, you've got 4 slots in attack filled up already. So you have to sacrifice some defence from the next midfielder you bring in. At the same time, we had problems with goalkeepers. Mignolet didn't quite hit the heights I hoped he would. Karius was our sort of budget option as an alternative.
One of my favourite Liverpool players all time. In the same way as Roy Hodgson was my favourite Liverpool
yeah,
manager.
I can imagine. Yeah, much the same way I want Richarlison back at Everton. And so, there was a clear upgrade needed at goalkeeper, and similarly at centre back. Spurs tore us apart earlier on in that season, winning 4-1 at Wembley. And if you look at the price required versus the improvement in performance that you get, defence was the place. And my data agreed with that, but I'm not going to claim that was data driven. The baseball background of the owners, Mike Gordon, knew very well the value for money. You get more bang for your buck from upgrading the defence than upgrading the attack. And Michael Edwards knew exactly the same thing as well. So we were all absolutely aligned on it. And, there's this concept of diminishing returns. So Coutinho was a loss. But if you've got 3 brilliant attackers already on the pitch and you score 3 goals per game, the 4th isn't going to get you an extra goal. It's going to get you an extra half a goal or something. It's not the same bang as going from 0 great attackers to 1 great attacker.
That backline then completed relatively in the bargain bin. Search for a right back ended when Klopp found one in the youth system, that gangly scouser with a triple barrel name, Trent Alexander-Arnold. We now know him as the scouser in Real Madrid's team. But on the other flank, several preferred options fell through. So Liverpool ended up buying the rights to Andy Robertson from then recently relegated Hull. Came in for, was it $10 million in 2017? And you knew he could bomb forward with his singular determination and energy. But his actual defending was harder to prove on a relegation level team. Klopp always talked about how he preferred players with, quote, extreme characteristics so that he would compensate elsewhere. But can you talk about Robbo, how you rounded out the team with his a definitive extreme characteristic and uncertainty fused onto him for a price far less than it would cost to build a title-winning squad otherwise?
With data, there's this like misconception that like data gives you the answer, and just ask the boffins, they'll crunch some numbers in their computer, and then it'll be like,
beep, 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 beep.
Yes, definitely Andy Robertson. And like we try to do that, but variance is important in football, and understanding variance is important. And Robertson was a thoroughly confusing player. So on the ball and in attack, consistently good, consistently great. If you say, I want an attacking fullback and I want to spend less than $10 million, even from 1 or 2 seasons ago, we'd say, well, Andy Robertson's the player. The confusing part was his defence. We always do our best to try and separate out the context. So if you're playing against rubbish opposition and you don't concede a goal, well, in the Premier League, you're not playing against rubbish opposition, so that's less relevant. If you keep a clean sheet against, I don't know, Gateshead or Everton or another rubbish team like that. And Robertson had done really well defensively in the Championship against worse teams, but then really badly against good teams in the Premier League. At the same time, they went from a 3 at the back system where he was a wing back, so less defensive responsibility, to a 4 at the back system and a really attacking style of play. So we were kind of like, well, he has been good defensively, but in a very different context. And he's been really bad, but they played attacking football and they maybe shouldn't have. Harry Maguire, another really good defender, was in that relegated Hull team, also conceding a record number of goals that season. Our opinion was he's not a great defender, so if you want someone to attack, he's your man. We don't think he's great at defence. He's been great in the past, but in a very different context. And Jurgen really needs credit for the signing because he said, I don't care if my fullback can defend. We can solve for that. I need him to attack. And Andy solved the problem himself by actually being a great defender. My big concern was he sort of profiled quite similar to Alberto Moreno, and then Moreno kept his place for 18 games before Andy got a chance in the first team. If Moreno hadn't got that injury, would Robertson have had the chance to shine?
You give me a sliding doors alt history of Liverpool Football Club that I kind of am fascinated by.
I recently met Everton's old director of football who said that they were this close to signing Robertson, but we swooped in there at the last minute.
Oh my God! By the way, the years of therapy I've had to experience after witnessing Andy Robertson house my team. I should send that ex-director of football the bills. Is the honest truth? God bless. I've got to say, I know I'm meant to hate him, and I hated every moment of him just utterly, not just beating us, but also taking every opportunity to crap on us in victory. There's something about his tenacity humanly that I really admire, and I don't know how you do. I don't know how can you data analyse for tenacity?
The psychological element's a really important part of the game, and data doesn't yet say much about it. You can kind of look at the data and guess certain psychological characteristics, but that's not really scientific. We did look at a project with a company where we would try and sort of gauge a player's psychology and their mentality and other things that people think are important to be successful. But they chickened out of it on sort of ethical grounds because delving deep into the privacy and psyche of people is somewhat morally dubious.
Yeah, that's fair. By the way, we're going to sign a new striker. We think he'll give us 30 goals a season. His psychological profile overlaps with that of Hannibal Lecter. Is that what you're saying?
I think we made a profit on him as well, didn't we?
Oh my God. The Champions League was won with drama in 2019. A year later, you won the Premier League at long last. I've got to ask you, humanly, you'd been pilloried. You throw in coaches and your data and labelled laptop nerds. The transfer committee had been derided in tabloid newspapers across the world. But in your tiny department in the back room of the training ground at Melrose, what did that victory feel like for you? Not just footballing victory, but vindication for your entire field. Stats and data could transform what was a fallen giant into the greatest team in the nation. And on the continent. What did that feel like and how did you celebrate?
It was mostly professional pride rather than relegation. And I think in 2012, it was a chance to show this stuff worked, or even worse than that, it was a chance to answer the question, does this stuff work or not? I think Liverpool was the place that really give us the chance to show it worked. So I think it's important to say Liverpool's success is not just data. The data side of things doesn't have a chance of making any difference if it's not for John Henry and FSG saying we believe in you, we're going to give you the tools you need. If it's not for the manager and the sporting director, taking notice of what we're saying, changing the decision, sometimes ignoring what we're saying, much as I wish they wouldn't. Sometimes it was the right thing to ignore what we were saying. So yeah, it took a great deal of professional pride in it. At the same time, there's always variance involved in football. And when we won the title, I think we'd finished second with 97 points the season before, and I'd gone around telling everyone we're not a 97-point team. We're going to regress next season because no team has ever improved from 97 points. And we went on to win 99 the next season. So it was great to be wrong in that title-winning season. It's great to be wrong with my third favourites prediction this season as well.
Oh my God, I got to say, I always believe football, the joy of it is that it teaches all of us that you know nothing and makes a fool out of all of us. I'm actually annoyed the way it made out a fool out of you was actually glorious. But you ultimately left Liverpool in 2023 in part because you, like Alexander, you conquered all the bloody worlds that you could with your boyhood club. Since then, Klopp's left too. Not saying that your decision influenced him, but just that he copied you. Leave it at that. To replace him, Liverpool went for a new Dutch bald dad, Arne Slot, a subdued sideline presence in comparison to Klopp. The guy's driven them to title glory, propelled by clear-eyed decision-making and the occasional dad joke. He went ahead, first time of asking, won the thing. I am interested, how do you interpret this title? When we talked a lot about it this year on all of our shows, Ian, did Klopp give Slot a brilliant inheritance, a squad at full power? Or does Slot's success suggest that maybe Klopp should have won more with the resources that he had available at his touch?
The squad was really good, I think. And the squad being really good, you've got to give a huge credit to Jurgen. One of the main things that changed when Jurgen arrived was whichever player you were interested in signing, the player was excited about the way Klopp's teams played football. They wanted to come, and actually signing the player that you want is a really hard thing to achieve. Most clubs don't have the luxury of doing that. So that squad being what it was, Jurgen deserves credit for that. I think my colleagues deserve credit for it as well. They retooled the midfield in the summer that I left. Those players are certainly ended up being really good. It's been really nice to see Gravenberch was always a player that the data really, really loved. And sort of similar to Mo in some ways, where you ask, why didn't he get the minutes at Bayern after being so brilliant at Ajax? And you sort of look at the talent in Bayern's team and it's the same answer to the same question. So all these years later, the same, clubs are acting in the same sort of way. So yeah, the squad was really good. Should Jurgen have got more out of them? He got plenty out of the squad. I think the main difference this year has been the squad stayed fit, and in the seasons that we struggled, the squad didn't stay fit. That's something, it's partly a result of Jurgen's heavy metal football. Every game's played at 100 miles an hour. I loved that style of football, and if we have to cope with a couple of injuries because of it, I'd much prefer that than no injuries and Roy Hodgson managing my team. But
those are the only two choices.
Yeah,
there's nothing in between.
Two choices. So Arne's brought something in between. I like football as entertainment as well as winning. I sometimes wish this season, would have been a bit more adventurous, but you can't really complain about the results.
Bring back Naby Keita, man.
Absolutely. I think, with Slot's less physical style, I think he'd slot right in there.
I love your idea of the risk decision making of Naby Keita, which is mind blowing. But it was the one big change. He just came on our show, Slot, and said last season the one change was really me, the manager. There'll be a lot more this off season. But turning over the manager and just flinging in a Chiesa at the death. The goalkeeper also brought, he's not even joined yet. It turned out to be the correct decision. It's pretty unfathomable, as the Premier League title shows. But at the time, it seemed like such a risk. Liverpool fans losing their minds, having finished behind both Manchester City and Arsenal 2 years in a row. But you've said half of all transfers fail, which is astonishing. Half of all transfers fail. If your first choice isn't available, more times than not, is doing nothing the correct choice in the transfer market if you can?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to squad management and succession planning. So if your first choice player's leaving and you've got no backup, you've got to go into the transfer market. The way you want to manage your squad is to never put yourself in that position. So if you go back to Andy Robertson, for example, we didn't have to go into the market, but Moreno, he was our only real left back. And I think Andy was third on the list, and the fourth choice would have been okay. But then the fifth choice was kind of like, there's not really much point signing this fifth choice player. And so because the squad was good, because there's already a big change coming, you kind of don't want to double down on that big change and say, well, the new squad, the current squad has to deal with the new manager. And by the way, we're also going to bring 3 new players in who are going to play in a slightly different way as well. I'll take you back to summer 2019. I think we'd won the Champions League, runner-up in the Premier League. What did we do in the transfer market? We brought in Adrian and Lonergan as second and third choice goalkeepers. And I think we might have done like 1 or 2 small pieces of business, and the same this season. So I'd say any club looking to win the title, just don't do any transfer business. Maybe bring in a second choice goalkeeper or a fourth choice forward, and you're sort of favourites for title next year. If Arsenal and City are listening to this is what I'd recommend them to do.
This summer is going to look different for Liverpool. Already wrapped up 2 key components, locking down Mo Salah and Virgil to new contracts. Those gents are 32 and 33 years old respectively, still clearly amongst the best in their position of what they do, but not likely to improve much in the coming years, probably for Mo in the coming decades. You talk about age curves, buying players pre-peak, which is roughly around 27, I think, depending on player and position. How do we evaluate, how should we evaluate these new contracts? I mean, Liverpool fans are over the moon. You were involved in Salah's last extension 2 years ago. When you're looking at data, when do you give an aging player a new contract and when do you cut your losses?
Just going back to 2012, we had this informal ban on 24-year-olds, above 24 years old, for that age curve reason. The one exception was James Milner, who was 29 when we signed him. It helped that he was a free transfer, but it also helped that his availability up till the age of 29 was brilliant, and his lifestyle and style of play meant that even though it's always an estimate and a forecast, we had some confidence he could continue producing that number of minutes and that level of quality well into his 30s. When I did the last Mo extension, I looked at a similar set of players. Nate Silver's got this old pick-outer idea where you grab a load of old baseball careers and see who's similar to this guy that I've got here. So I did the same thing for Mo and found a set of similar players like Ronaldo, Lewandowski, Benzema, and there were maybe 10 others. It's kind of those players that continued to play at the highest level, continued to hit 3,000 minutes a season by the age of 31. They kept doing it until they were 33. And Mo has kept doing it till he's 33. Now, I don't know, but I'm guessing my old colleagues have gone through a similar process and they've got some data that only they know about Mo, like, how hard his abs actually are. And maybe that sort of abs test has said, yeah, these abs are going to keep going until he's 40.
That's amazing. Seamus Coleman is 87 in dog years. But the reality is Chelsea were the first club to create an analytics team in 2008. But now everybody's got their data, their analytics. But you go into like any team's headquarters, they're always given a tiny office. These mostly young guys just tapping away quietly. And the comms team always like, oh yeah, those are the data guys. Brighton, Bournemouth, Brentford, unbelievable. They also now clubs that don't start with a B doing the biz, spurred in large part by American ownership, changing how the game's approached. I loved your take on increasing American ownership in the Premier League. You said, God bless America. But with so many teams now sifting through the same raw numbers, are there still market inefficiencies to exploit? Is it much harder than it was when you started work on this at Liverpool over a decade ago?
Yes. There are still many market efficiencies to exploit. Take a look at last summer's transfers, the ones everyone was excited about. I haven't looked myself, but I'm going to guess based on past statistics, about half of them will have failed. So those success rates aren't really going up very much. And there's two reasons. The first one's implementation. So an American owner that comes in and says, we're going to do things this way, your typical British response to that is, yes, boss, we're on it. Yeah, I've hired a data guy. And as you say, the data guy or girl sits in the corner and is roundly ignored by everyone. And the second one is really the arms race is increasing. So at Liverpool, we were among the first. I know Arsenal had a really good group and Barcelona did as well. So they'd got there similar times. We were the first group to really implement a tracking model. So taking advantage of all that lovely off-ball data that tells you something about defenders that you don't see in the simple data. It took us 2 years before we had anything. 2 years and 2 PhDs to do it. And everyone but the biggest clubs are not investing to that sort of level. I've just, with my new company, just made the first version. My colleagues have just made the first version of our new tracking model, and it took us 9 months and 3 PhDs this time around. So we got there quicker, but added 1 PhD to the process. And
a lot of E. coli calculations. I spoke at the Sloan Statistics Conference one year with Daryl Morey, president of basketball operations at the 76ers. He's obsessed with football now, like a lot of people who are into data. And he said the following to me. The NBA is 10 years behind Major League Baseball when it comes to data usage. And in his mind, football is 10 years behind the NBA. I don't know if you agree with that, but if we use those sports as roadmaps, what's the future of data analytics in the Premier League, and what are the next frontiers to explore?
When I joined Decision Technology, my boss at the time tried to persuade me to stay. And my reason to him for leaving was, I look at the NBA and all of the top third-party data people, they're now inside clubs. And what happens in the NBA will happen in football in 10 years' time. So I kind of agree with Daryl. I think in football's defence, you say basketball's 10 times more complicated than baseball. Well, football's 10 times more complicated than basketball. So to be 10 years behind, that's fine. That's no criticism of football as far as I'm concerned. Next steps for football, I think recruitment's not done yet because of tracking data. Really adding value to what you can build with simpler models. There's a lot more juice to be squeezed from that lemon. And then with tracking data, that's the minimum complexity of data that's possible for you to say something about in one game, how did this player perform, and to have a sensible conversation with a coach. So that's where football is not at yet, is at the one game level, having that coach conversation, which you can do in basketball and baseball.
By that you mean what, Ian? Just so everyone, meaning me, simple boys, understand.
So from our tracking model, for example, we get player ratings per game. And if you use event data where you only see the on-ball actions, just having watched the game yourself and saying, I think like back in the old Castrol Index days, I think Steven Gerrard I had as man of the match when England got thumped by Germany in the World Cup. They lost 4-1, but Gerrard had played outstandingly in that game. And England had lost. It was the best of all possible worlds. But you kind of know it's not a defensible position. You can't have that argument with the coach because the coach would be quite right to say you're wrong. He's right and you're wrong. With tracking data, you can pinpoint each time you said this player did something right or this player did something wrong, and you've got a chance of being as right as the coach is about it.
In this nation, America, there's always been a feeling that American players, there's a bias against them. I mean, you're a data man, so you don't even think about where the country comes from. There's always a sense if you look at an Argentinian, an Italian, and an American with similar ballpark skill sets, you never choose the American. You're on the inside. Does that even still factor in? Is that still a thing?
It's the great thing about data is it's democratic, like your great country still is. And, you know, it's one of my favourite things that old tropes about, it's not just Americans, but, you know, sub-Saharan Africans, North Africans, Eastern Europeans, Asians, Scandinavians, British players, they've all got their own horrible set of stereotypes, and data just washes that away. I think, like with American players, that kind of skillful, you know, what's the best player in football? It's always your number 10. He's the most skillful player. And America has not produced those sort of players. Pulisic would be the closest, I'd say. Well, let's say not produced them to the same level that other countries have. And I think, I don't know anything about how American kids develop in soccer, so I might be completely mistaken. But I think there is more selection for athleticism in American sports because they've got other sports they can choose where athleticism is a more important component. And athleticism, you can get by without it in football. It's just not as important a component, especially in those really high-profile positions.
Oh, last one. I just broken my heart, but you spoke in truth. Are you North Wales or you South Wales, Ian?
South Wales.
So I've got to take you to North Wales for 1 second. Wrexham Football Club. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they just got into the Championship, essentially with some young talent, and then betting on your 38-year-old Stephen Fletchers and your Jay Rodriguez's and the rest. They're in the Championship. What's the kind of profile of footballer they should be looking for in this next phase if you were to advise them?
Wrexham's a great story, but they've kind of been reasonably traditional in their approach so far. In football, you know, there's a chapter about football finances in my book, and money talks in football. If you want success, you can ask Man City, you can ask Blackburn Rovers back in the 90s. You put your hand in your pocket and you pay for that success. And that's what Wrexham did. So forgive me if the numbers are slightly wrong, but it was like 5 or 6 million quid to get out of National League. So they got out of National League by paying way more than anyone else in terms of wages, maybe some transfer fees as well. And they got out of League Two in the similar way. League One, they were much more in line with top League One clubs. So there was a lot more sort of not purely money-driven sporting success in this season's story is kind of the best yet. In the Championship, they've got the choice to keep on putting their hand in their pocket, but the numbers ramp up. They multiply up by, a factor of 3 or 4 in the Championship. So are they going to keep putting their money in their pockets? If not, the profile they need to get is exactly the same as what Liverpool was looking for, which is younger players with an upside. You can sell on to the Premier League, or you can keep them, get the best performance out of them, and take Wrexham to the Premier League. I think it's a multi-year project unless they're going to sort of become a top-spending Championship club this season.
Don't like to speak for Ian, but I think what he said, Wrexham with Naby Keita in the middle and Richarlison at the top, they can't be beat. And I got to tell you, I have learnt so bloody much for being with you. Thank you for explaining your game. Your book, How to Win the Premier League, I cannot recommend it to our listeners around the world. Ian was showing me beforehand it in the multiple languages it's been translated to, and it deserves that and more. You can read it, crack the code. You put it in such human terms. The book was one of my books of last year. Recommending now it's out in America to everybody, to you, to your family, to more. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Rog. Pleasure to talk to you.
Courage.